we are living in this chronic crisis now, brought here by this system of the capitalist system. And it's basically in stage with where every war is a resource war and everything's about grabbing and controlling and maintaining that control of what is left as it all dwindles, as populations explode, as prices continually go up. That is the context of everything now. And then we have to have the coverage of what governments are doing, what contracts are being signed by the corporate powers. I mean, that's such a great example that you shared with BP's CEO being invited to Washington to give that figure of how much oil is in Iraq. That should be the headline.
Welcome to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bring you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today's guest on the newscast is journalist Dahr Jamail, widely known for his work as an unembedded reporter in Iraq in the early aughts, helping to uncover the realities of the war on the ground. Jamail is also versed in the climate and environmental beats. In today's episode, he speaks with co-host Rachel Donald about resource wars, how climate change and growing ecological pressures fuel and exacerbate these wars, as well as the efforts that justify them. Jamail and Donald also examine how current geopolitical tensions could evolve as select nations increasingly dominate the market in sectors such as renewable energy.
Dahr, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Rachel. It's great to be here.
Now, I think to dive right in, it'd be great for you to tell our audience how it was that you ended up in Iraq reporting on the war there and the amazing perspective that it's given you on geopolitical forces today.
I was not a working journalist in any capacity during the time of the buildup and then launching of the illegal invasion of Iraq by the United States and its so-called allies. But I was so aghast at how it was being covered in the corporate media, the complete lack of context, the complete lack of, this was obviously a gross violation of international law and just an oil grab, essentially. It was literally an overt resource war.
Two important notes here. According to a press release from the International Commission of Jurists, known as the ICJ, from the 18th of March, 2003, expressing dismay over a potentially, quote, outright illegal invasion of Iraq, it stated that the U.S., along with other states such as the U.K. and Spain, in the absence of a UN Security Council resolution, that they had, quote, no other plausible legal basis for this attack. They also stated that, quote, the evidence presented by states pressing for war is less than convincing. It is also important to note that the true justifications for the U.S. invasion of Iraq are still publicly debated today, even though federal government officials, scholars, and journalists are on record indicating that oil was a primary or contributing factor. There is still some lingering disagreement on this subject today. Reporting from Dahr Jamail himself in Al Jazeera dated 2012 indicates that U.S. firms previously locked out of Iraq since 1973 were able to obtain lucrative oil contracts as a result of the invasion.
And I was comparing the coverage in the United States to that abroad and was just sickened. And so I literally sent myself to Iraq, figured out how to get in and start working first as a blogger and then very shortly thereafter a full-fledged journalist. And that's really what started a 20-year career as a journalist, covering first largely that off and on for 10 years, and then going into other effects of resources like the BP oil disaster, and then ultimately the climate crisis. So that's really, I launched my career on a resource war, but that was not by design. That was just kind of how it worked out.
You were working in a national park, weren't you?
Yeah, I was actually first guiding and then as a volunteer rescue ranger up on Denali in Denali National Park in Alaska. A little bit of a
It's
change.
amazing. And to be honest, I can I can understand why somebody obviously with a passion for the natural world would be the type to kind of take themselves off on this mission to uncover the truth of what was going on. Now, resource wars are a totally prevalent topic of conversation today. Very, very necessary topic of conversation today, given the massive movements that are happening, these tectonic plates of geopolitical forces. But we're not really seeing it being discussed yet in the mainstream media. In fact, there doesn't particularly seem to be too much of a connection between resources and climate crisis yet.
Articles discussing the intersection of resource wars and climate change have been published. And for listeners interested, I recommend reading The Age of Energy Insecurity, published by the magazine Foreign Affairs. How Climate Change Could Lead to More Wars in the 21st Century, from Vox. The World Could Be Entering a New Era of Climate War, by The Atlantic, and How Water Shortages Are Brewing Wars, by the BBC, as well as UK's ex-science chief predicts century of resource wars, published by The Guardian in 2009. Rachel and I discussed this piece, and also the one published by Vox, in the post-show conversation of this episode.
People are on the fringe a little bit worried about water. There's occasionally the odd article about, oh no, running out of olive oil again in Europe. But the massive push for increasing LNG, liquefied natural gas, export, import, access to gold, copper, access to more oil, all of these things. It's really flying under the radar at the moment, even though to me, it seems like the main decision behind most political moves at the moment. So can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, you're right. I mean, I'm having the same experience watching the coverage and primarily lack thereof of what's driving these forces, from the hot wars going on to the cold wars that are ongoing, that ultimately it is coming down to, it always has been about resources, but now I think more than ever in a very dramatic fashion, whether we're talking about land for farming, arable land, particularly water. There was a saying a ways back by Lester Brown, who he said, land is the new gold and water is the new oil. And I think that perspective is really kind of driving what we're seeing. So if we look at, for example, what's happening in Palestine, in Israel, where what Israel has done with the water of Palestinians for decades, but especially now with gas supplies just off the coast of Gaza, that with how Israel's handling the invasion and the bombing of Gaza compared to already having plans of where settlements will go in that area. So again, land, water, resources, and so often, well, maybe always, these wars are masked with these ideologies of, well, they're terrorists or they're evil, et cetera. Well, that whole terrorist trope, that's exactly what was trotted out for the invasion of Iraq, trying to tie Saddam Hussein to the events of September 11th in this country. Again, all of it absolutely bogus propaganda used to justify what is essentially a resource grab.
Listeners who remember the events of the 2003 invasion of Iraq are probably familiar with former Vice President Dick Cheney claiming that Saddam Hussein, the fifth president of Iraq, possessed, quote, weapons of mass destruction on August 26, 2002. There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us, he said. Yet, no such evidence existed. For listeners interested in a full breakdown of this, I recommend journalist Johnny Harris's video report titled How the U.S. Stole Iraq, which you can find on YouTube. As to media complicity in a pro-war bias, an article in Neiman Reports from Stephen Cull states the following. A study conducted in 2003 by Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, FAIR, tracking the frequencies of pro-war and anti-war commentators on the major networks, found that pro-war views were overwhelmingly more frequent.
And we grow weary watching this over and over and over, and really the tactic doesn't change. But similarly today, and I would expect that not to change in the future, where whatever the country is that's going to be in need of water, for example, what are those wars how are they going to be justified and then presented to the general public once they're launched? I mean, there's one study, for example, that shows Saudi Arabia, that their fossil aquifers, which is outside of desalination plants, really their primary water source, if not their only water source. That water could be running dry by 2030. That's not real far from now. I mean, we're talking about less than 6 years in a country of roughly 30 million people. So what happens when they run out of water? Where do they start attacking? Where do their people go? And then what happens to those places where those people go? We can look at a lot of the Arab Spring having occurred because of lack of resources, because of farmers not having enough water, prices getting too high, not getting enough help from corrupt governments, et cetera. I mean, the examples of resource wars are all around us, and we're all living with the impacts of them already. And we all know that these are only going to increase exponentially into the future.
To me, this sort of simultaneous obfuscation of the reality of resources and the disavowal of like the necessity of resources is part of like the double think that we live in of this modern economy. The fact that we don't really seem to understand that GDP means energy, not pounds or dollars or euros. The fact that our water and our gas comes through pipes, and it seems totally divorced from a reality that it's been pulled out of, extracted from the ground somewhere. The fact that economic growth is always going to be predicated on more and more consumption of very real material things. There's just this weird thing happening today. Double think or illusion in which the material, everything that we have is material. Even money in the bank has come from the production of something material, the consumption of something material, the use of something material. And economists and politicians constantly deny it. They constantly deny it, and they create these fictions of ideologies, including economic ideology. And they use this to mask the reality that an economy of death, let's call it, economy of death, feeds off of living material things. And so, I mean, listen, you'll love this. I interviewed John Brown recently, who was the head on Planet Critical, who was the head of BP during the invasion. And he said to me during the interview that he was invited to the Pentagon just before the invasion because they were curious if he could figure out how much oil was in Iraq.
John Brown, the former CEO of British Petroleum from 1995 until 2007, said on an interview with Rachel Donald last November that he went to the Pentagon to be asked how much oil he thought Iraq could produce. When Rachel asked him to clarify when this occurred, he said that he couldn't recall the exact date, but it was, quote, sometime around the invasion of Iraq. You can listen to that conversation via Rachel's podcast, Planet Critical. It's also important to note here that according to an article from The Guardian from the 30th of October 2002, John Brown reportedly warned Washington not to, quote, carve up Iraqi oil riches, unquote.
And I was like, oh my God, you said the quiet bit out loud. Like, no, this is, and like we all know it. We all know it in the public arena as well. And yet still there is like peddling this story around weapons of mass destruction and all of this kind of stuff. Now, I think it's, if you'll know probably the figures off the top of your head, hopefully, but let's talk about how much oil was extracted from Iraq and the decimating effect that that's had on the population before we turn our eyes to look at what's currently going on in the Middle East under the guise of ideological wars.
Yeah, well, first of all, I really appreciate what you just shared, because talking about the basic resources that this is all about really illustrates this is kind of the greatest part of the denial of the capitalist system, that we are taking all these resources, they're all finite, they're running out. In many places, they're already gone. And yet we're going to keep going forward and expanding forever. It is the ultimate denial that is hitting the wall in a lot of places already and rapidly approaching the wall in others. And speaking to Iraq specifically, I don't know off the top of my head the figure of how much oil was successfully extracted for Western interests. And there were multiple Western companies that had access to that oil. I do know that ultimately it certainly didn't come anywhere close, not even in the ballpark of what the U.S. had hoped to get. That there was enough attacks on that infrastructure that those plans many of them were largely thwarted, and other countries stepped in and started doing business there, i.e. China, without having to fire a shot, helped along simply by the U.S. coming in and removing Saddam Hussein. But of course, because of how the U.S. botched the occupation so grandly, killing over 1 million people, displacing several million internally and externally, and the country in shambles to this day.
Exact numbers on how many Iraqis died in the Iraq War aren't available since not all deaths are counted, and there are documented cases of severe undercounting of civilian deaths by the U.S., and many deaths are also considered indirect or not as a result of fighting. However, the Brown University Watson Institute of International and Public Affairs estimates that all post-9/11 wars in several countries contributed to 4.5 million deaths, with 38 million people displaced. In Iraq specifically, exact counts are disputed and vary. The Lancet previously estimated as much as 600,000, while the Iraq Body Count Project estimated 300,000. But indirect deaths, Brown's report points out, are extremely difficult to calculate and can happen months after food disruption, for example. One such estimate from 2013 put the number of both direct and indirect deaths at 461,000. This too is also criticized. The reality is we may never know the exact figure.
That the U.S. has not been very successful in this oil grab is the short version of that story. So think about the amount of Iraqi lives killed, displaced, changed forever, the cost to the U.S. government. I think it's important for people to remember also that the U.S. has not entirely left Iraq. Before I get to the recent attacks on U.S. troops there, let's remember that there's multiple U.S. military bases within Iraq. They still very much maintain a presence there, as well as across much of the rest of the Middle East. Let's remember that the U.S. Theater of Operations headquarters for that region is a giant base just outside of Doha in Qatar. And the U.S. maintains a large military presence within Jordan and other places around the Middle East as well. So let's not forget that presence is ongoing despite the propaganda and rhetoric. There was a giant U.S. withdrawal from Iraq. Yes, they took out a large number of troops, but they have never intended and continue to not intend to ever leave the country fully because of the ongoing resource problem, lack thereof. And so that presence was recently highlighted, however, by attacks on some of those U.S. military personnel inside of Iraq as a blowback of U.S. unbridled support of Israel in their attack against Gaza. So an ongoing genocide.
Both Rachel and Dahr use the word genocide in their conversation to describe Israel's actions against the people of Gaza and Palestine. It's important to note the ICJ has found the current genocide case against Israel plausible and issued provisional orders to the nation to prevent genocidal acts back in January of this year. However, a full and official ruling could take years. A UN special reporter on the right to food says the intentional denial of food to Gazans is, quote, a situation of genocide. As of early March, the UN cited that the death toll of Palestinians stood at 31,184. It was not until the 25th of March that the UN Security Council passed a resolution demanding a ceasefire, with the U.S. abstaining.
So those attacks really drew that military presence, probably to the chagrin of the Pentagon, back into the fleeting awareness of the media, where they had to cover that there were U.S. casualties in Iraq as a result of blowback from the U.S. complicit support of Israel in their ongoing attack in Gaza. So that was brought to light. And then that, of course, does bring us to the recent ongoing hot war, resource war and there's multiple layers to this. There's certainly other agendas in addition to it being a resource war, but this is ultimately a resource war, that there is not enough water in those areas. If we're talking about the Middle East. So this is about water. There are a large amount of gas reserves just off the coast of Gaza that Israel absolutely wants to have full control of. They also want the land to continue to expand settlements across that area. And some of that actually has made, at least in the alternative media, a little bit of coverage of the fact that they're already drawing up plans for settlements in different areas of Gaza. So let's not forget that this too, however it's being couched in the mainstream media, is ultimately also a resource war.
In an opinion piece by Sultan Barakat published in Al Jazeera, he states, in late October, the Israeli Ministry of Energy and Infrastructure announced that it had awarded concessions for natural gas exploration to Israeli and foreign companies in zones that significantly overlap with the maritime borders of Gaza.
Totally. It's very frightening to witness how this genocide is being covered, typically by mainstream media. All the attention given to political ideology, religious ideology, and none being given to, exactly as you're saying, the Middle East is a resource scarce place in many respects, apart from with fossil fuels. Israel is the one Western stronghold in this fossil fuel rich region, and it suits Israel's allies and itself to expand and get more land. Gaza, Palestine, and off the coast of Palestine sits $500 billion worth of gas.
A UN report confirmed $453 billion in 2017 dollars worth of oil in the Levant Basin in 2019.
And the European Union was one of the coalitions of states that signed a memorandum of understanding with Israel in 2022, summer 2022, that it would supply Europe with gas. And so Europe also kind of depends on Israel's access. It is so obviously driven in so many respects by resources, and yet this is just not something that is talked about.
Forgive me for going on tangents here. There's just so many rich things here to be talked about, but we also have to talk about overpopulation. Population numbers continue to climb across most of the globe in most countries, but certainly in the Middle East. And that is a huge issue held directly up against the wall of limited resources, shrinking resources, availability, et cetera. So that's something that has to be addressed, or at least noted as well as a prime factor in the thinking of countries that have control of certain resources. What is their thinking going forward? How many people are going to need to be served by those resources, et cetera? And the other thing that comes to mind is really we are in this massive crisis of shrinking resources, overpopulation, everything's getting more expensive against the backdrop of the climate crisis of droughts worsening, floods worsening, periods in between those floods extending, all of this, huge storms, heat waves, all of this. And this is all, none of this is being talked about. We get maybe bits and pieces of fragments, but again, not within the broader context of all of it being talked about together. And that is imperative because all of these things are playing off each other. All of them, this is why we talk about it in terms of polycrisis, because it's all one giant feedback loop, right? Like reporting on the climate, I got very used to talking about feedback loops repetitively and explaining them. Well, this is all its own massive feedback loop, and it's all feeding off each other and making every component of said feedback loop more intense as we go forward.
Yes, thank you for all of that. So many excellent points there. And towards the end, I was just thinking about how do I put this? Almost the trick that's been played in media, this myth of objectivity. And you and I like to talk about this. Maybe we should just point to it here, flag it here. Because really what we need in a time of polycrisis is people that can synthesize information, analyze the big picture, and communicate the big picture. But fundamentally, in order to communicate the big picture, there are going to have to be some, not sweeping statements, but you're going to have to be jumping from point to point, essentially, in order to be able to communicate everything effectively and quickly as kind of needs to happen in a conversation. And yet media have essentially been barred from doing that. Journalists are barred from giving opinions. They are barred from considering themselves experts on anything. They are barred. News journalists are often barred from analysis, and they're not allowed to stray from their own beat. So we have all of this going on, all of these terrible, terrible crises: biodiversity crisis, water crisis, food crisis, pollution crisis, climate crisis, alongside a geopolitical force that is preparing to continue the same political ideology that got us here, which is the war machine, as opposed to global collaboration and cooperation. And we don't really have a mouthpiece who's allowed to talk about it on the airwaves, essentially.
That's right. I mean, really important points. And gosh, this unpacks so much. We could talk about this for hours. I mean, because I got involved. I sent myself to Iraq because I was just utterly aghast at the level of so-called journalism that the corporate media pretended to have. I mean, they're basically pretending to be journalists, and there is no context. There is none of this background information. I mean, giving people just these sound bites on, for example, the invasion of Iraq, like it was all about, so if you watch US media, there was just a graphic of the outline of the country of Iraq with Saddam's face superimposed on it with a giant bullseye on him. I mean, that was literally on CNN regularly. And so that's the level of coverage. Of course, ignoring his long-standing, decades-long dealings with the U.S. government, ignoring his relations with throughout the Reagan administration. We're going to ignore the fact that it was the U.S. that did sell him basic components for chemical weapons that he went on to use against Kurdish population in his country. We're going to ignore, and I could go on for an hour about other relevant context, but we'll ignore all that. And without the context of everything you and I have discussed, and we're just talking about highlights. I mean, there's so many more points we could get into, but without all of that context, people don't have the information to understand that we are living in this chronic crisis now, brought here by this system of the capitalist system. And it's basically in stage with where every war is a resource war, and everything's about grabbing and controlling and maintaining that control of what is left as it all dwindles, as populations explode, as prices continually go up. That is the context of everything now. And then we have to have the coverage of what governments are doing, what contracts are being signed by the corporate powers. I mean, that's such a great example that you shared with BP's CEO being invited to Washington to give that figure of how much oil is in Iraq. That should be the headline, not the graphic of Saddam Hussein's face superimposed on outline of the country of Iraq and with a bullseye on him. The BP story, that's the headline. And that example could be used, right, of every major headline story that just pull open your browser, open whatever news you're looking at and look at the headlines and contrast that with everything that we're talking about right now.
Thank you, Dahr. It's you have to wonder how people can get organized and mobilize when they just don't have the right information, which I'm sure is obviously part of the project, quite frankly, at this point: divide and conquer and confuse. I think a point of confusion that we should touch on, and this can be our last highlight, would be the Cold War with China. Because China, I think, is quite a particularly interesting example. given it's managed to position itself as dominating the supply chains of renewable or rebuildable energy. So it's got access to a huge amount of materials, precious minerals, metals, all of these kinds of things. It's essentially eco-colonized Africa, most of the Pacific. It's managed to dominate most industry in Australia as well. And we now also seem to be in a position whereby if we were to go to a renewable future, which has its own problems, do not get me wrong. I'm sure you saw that recent report come out by the UN that said a renewable energy system would increase the world's mining by 60%, which would have devastating knock-on effects to the climate.
This has been reported on in outlets such as The Guardian. A UN analysis released in February says that extraction of raw materials could rise by 60% by 2060, stressing impacts related to climate change, water and biodiversity loss, land use change, and air pollution, all of which it already contributed a significant amount to.
But say we were to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and go down that path, it also essentially guarantees China's economic ascension to the top. And it would seem to me that part of the Cold War between the United States and China, and the United States betting on gas and backing its allies on gas and trying to just get more and more of that and further its subsidies for gas, fossil fuels. It's also because they don't want China to win this Cold War. What do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I agree on all points. And I really can't add to that other than just take it another step in another direction, which this is everything you just articulated is, I can't think of a bigger accelerant to everything that we've been talking about than this, because just with China, with its population explosion, with its economy continuing to expand as it is, the resources it needs as a country, the grabs it's making and then that putting it in head-on conflict, both cold and potentially hot with the West, is really kind of, it almost feels like the final act or could be one of the final great acts of this horrible, horrible play that's literally destroying the planet. And I can't think of really a worse situation to be happening and looming ever larger on the horizon each day than the cold and potentially hot war with China in the West that you just articulated.
Yes, I agree. It's been out of the news recently because of the genocide in Palestine by Israel. Yet it looms. It's there, exactly as you say. There's lots of kind of movement happening in the Pacific and Australia, lots of security deals being signed and trade deals being negotiated. And the thing I think I'm most scared about is a tempestuous leader of the United States who cannot see long-term enough, decides that triggering a hot war, while it is still just more developed than China, might be the only way to quote unquote win. I think that to me is the most frightening sort of immediate possibility at this stage.
And that's very much a possibility. As you can probably wouldn't be surprised to imagine, I'm quite cynical about what I see looming on the horizon in this country with the upcoming election and how Trump is positioning himself to, no matter how it goes, to declare victory, and then how things flake out after that. I think we have to brace for absolute chaos in this country. And of course, that would have immediate, widespread geopolitical impact immediately, let alone talking about what the possibility is with launching a war against China. It's really, I think that, of course, then we have to talk about the potential of nuclear weapons being used in all of this. And all this is to say, not to try to just scare people, but just to be aware of the very real and extremely dangerous implications of all of this as we live at the brink, as this whole system is on the brink of coming up against hard limits that it's running into now. And the race for what's left only intensifies. The stakes only continue to get higher, don't they?
They do. And I think that's where we should leave it. Dahr, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom today.
Always great talking with you, Rachel. Thank you.
So this is a really interesting conversation, and it's, making me think about the early 2000s again and bringing back a lot of memories, frankly, of that time. How was this conversation for you, Rachel?
Fascinating. I love speaking with Dahr. I think he's got such a unique breadth of knowledge, but also very particular detailed knowledge around very important things. I mean, whenever I speak to him, I feel like I could speak to him for the entire day, because obviously in an hour, you're only just scratching the surface of all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what's most important as to what Dahr brings to the table as a former war reporter is that he really ties this into economic motivations and the resource necessitations of growing an economy. And as you can probably hear in the recording, I think that it is very, very important when we're communicating about the atrocities that are going on around the world.
Yeah, it's super important. And you know what else is interesting is I just did a little deep dive and tried to look at what other people were saying in retrospect after the Iraq War. And I actually found it really interesting that key members of the federal government admitted openly that it was a war for oil. For instance, former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel said, "People say we're not fighting for oil. Of course we are." He said that in 2007. Alan Greenspan wrote in his memoir saying, "I am saddened that it is politically inconvenient to acknowledge what everyone knows, the Iraq War is largely about oil." So, I mean, it's interesting to me to hear the retrospective of people years after it started. I just thought that was really interesting.
It's wild that these people aren't before The Hague. That's a call I still see regularly on Twitter. Why Bush and Blair aren't before The Hague when it's something that we know, it's something that both of their cabinets / administrations, members of which have come to admit. I recently interviewed John Brown, who admitted to going to Washington to discuss the amount of oil before the invasion. It's common knowledge. And so they illegally invaded a nation. And why it is that they can still trot about the world, making millions, giving speeches on diplomacy. And I mean, Blair was the guy who offered himself up as a peace convoy when Israel illegally invaded Gaza. Are you kidding?
Yeah, I mean, this is all really, really, really crazy stuff to me. There was another thing I wanted to bring up, and I think a lot of listeners will find this quite interesting. So the former UK science chief back in 2001 went to the Bush White House essentially to convince them not to go into Iraq. Well, let me just read the quote that he said. He actually said this. He said, "I went into the White House in 2001 to persuade them that decarbonizing their economy was the way forward. I didn't get much shrift at that time. What I can tell you is that if I had managed to persuade the government of America that investing, instead of going into Iraq, in decarbonizing their economy with roughly a tenth of the estimated $3 trillion the U.S. spent on the war, they would have managed it." So that was in The Guardian in 2009. The reporter was James Randerson. So I thought that was really interesting. I just stumbled upon that and threw me for a loop. Yeah.
$3 trillion on illegally invading another nation, killing millions of people, destabilizing a region.
Again, to be precise here, the estimates for Iraq alone aren't millions, but certainly millions estimated for all the post 9/11 wars and hundreds of thousands for Iraq alone. But these are almost certainly underestimates. If you want to read the full report from Stephanie Savell, How Death Outlives War, I've linked the study in the show notes of this episode. Additionally, the $3 trillion figure cited here is just an estimate. The total cost of the Iraq War varies, but the Cost of War Project at Brown University estimated in 2020 that it is $1.92 trillion.
And all for oil. And as Dahr said, there wasn't even as much as they hoped there would be. It's astonishing when you think about what that could have done for the American people. Whether a long-term investment in their own energy infrastructure or, I don't know, doing any of the things that other very wealthy nations have, like having a better healthcare system or having a better education system or having a better everything system. It's just it gets me, I get very, very upset with this. I think the more that I learn about the geopolitics of the world and science, and how often there has been a crossover with scientists warning politicians over the past 50 years about the climate crisis, about our energy demands, about our resource demands, and they've just been ignored time and time and time again. And for what? For what? For the displacement and murder of millions of people around the world, and it's only going to get worse.
Yeah, I don't want it to sound too grim for our listeners here, but
It is grim.
I also, it is quite grim. I looked into more about, like, as you and Dahr are talking about resource wars, there's actually been a number of experts that have written books on this, like detailing their warnings about how the climate crisis will either exacerbate or fuel resource wars. And there was an interview in Vox from 2017 from Sean Illing from a book by a man named Harold Melzer. And he wrote a book called Climate Wars: Why People Will Be Killed in the 21st Century. It's a short little Q&A, but in this, I just want to read this part from the end of the interview where Sean says, "Can Western democratic society, which is built on a system of limitless growth and productivity, change its destructive relationship with nature?" And Harold responds, "This is the biggest question of the 21st century. Here's the paradox. Modern liberal democratic societies are successful at improving the lives and freedoms of people who live in them. The problem is that these systems are based on the exploitation of nature and our environment, and we're trapped in this paradigm. I think we need something like a new theory of modernity. We need a societal model that is able to cope with all these ecological problems that are on the table, and right now we just don't have one." I thought that was an interesting little exchange. Your thoughts, Rachel?
Yeah, missing also an exploitation of people. And I think as well, this broad brush of weird countries, Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic, weird countries like improve the well-being of the quality of life of the people within them. That's actually going down. I think someone studied this and has noted that around, when was it? I think 2016 is actually the year when quality of life has started to descend on average in weird countries.
I wasn't able to find a report in 2016, but I did find one in 2020 from the Social Progress Index, which said only 3 countries out of 163 had a reduction in key quality of life indicators. They are the United States, Brazil, and Hungary. The US had the sharpest decline of these 3.
And also, given the amount of money available relative to what is spent for the benefit of, I just think it's a really, really actual sweeping statement to make, especially when we know we have a mental health crisis going on and still, fine. The exploitation and extraction of nature, absolutely, but also the exploitation and extraction of other people. It's George Monbiot who says that the civil rights that were won in the 20th century were won off the back of growing our economies through thieving the resources, the lands, the lives of people from the global south. So, yeah, I mean, what do you think about it?
I mean, the exchange occurred in 2017, so I think that sort of lines up with the figure you cited about quality of life starting to decrease in 2016 in some nations. Yeah, I think the statement was a little broad. And I agree with your nuances on it. I do agree, though, that he has a really great point that a lot of the systems that in wealthy industrialized nations are definitely built on the exploitation of nature and the environment, and also the exploitation of people, as you just pointed out.
Yeah.
I also think he's correct that we're still trapped in that paradigm. We don't have an answer for it, or at least if we do have an answer for it, we're not heeding its call.
I think we have to be careful. I think we do have answers. We've got lots and lots of answers, and we've always had answers. There's degrowth, there's ecofeminism, there's different forms of ecocracies that people have been working on for a really, really, really long time. There's like solar punk that gives a look into how you can meld all of that with technology. I think we have to be very careful not falling into the trap of we don't actually have any ideas yet, or we've run out of time, or it would be too expensive, and all of these kinds of things, which are frankly paroles that have been pushed by right-wing think tanks for the past few years. So we do have lots and lots and lots of solutions from political to technological, it all demands a constriction in our energy usage. And the reason that we haven't is because there have been very, very deliberate attempts by industry and by politicians to ensure that this current wealthy industrialized mode of being, which is incredibly dominating and provides a huge amount to a few, of which the class to which they belong, that's why it's not happened yet. That's why they're not heeding scientists' warnings.
Right. Yeah, I should have prefaced my previous statement. When I said answers, I meant more like the responses we're taking are not an answer to the problem. Like the solutions are obviously there, but we're not using them.
Yeah.
The other thing you pointed out, which I thought was really bears repeating here, is that this growing trend, or at least the historical trend of scientists warning governments of ecological decline and looming catastrophe, which has been going on for decades, 50 years, as you mentioned. And there was this story in The Guardian about the 1977 White House climate memo that was delivered to Jimmy Carter. And it basically was warning about all the stuff that we're experiencing now with climate change. And I just wonder if the United States had actually heeded that warning and taken it more seriously, I wonder how much further along we'd be right now.
Totally. It's like Limits to Growth was published in 1973, this massive seminal text, this report. And it was the first systems map of the world, essentially. And they gave different potential outcomes. And so they modeled, if we continue as we are, if we decrease a little bit, if we could, blah, 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 whatever. They modeled different scenarios. And on the 50-year anniversary of the report last year in 2023, scientists showed that we are on track for the worst model. We are bang on. And so, according to them, society is going to collapse in the 21st century. That report was also delivered to politicians, and it was completely ignored. And there's an excellent podcast, The Tipping Point, and they walk through the story of how that report was commissioned and then buried because people didn't like essentially what the conclusion was. So it's time and time and time again. And I cannot get my head around what people who, when faced with this kind of information and have more power than your average person, not unlimited, nobody can snap their fingers and change the world. And I understand there's a huge amount of pressure on them to actually maintain the status quo, but still, you are faced with this information and you choose not only to do nothing, but to double down on the thing that's causing the problem. I can't get my head around the thought process that enables people to make that decision. Especially when it includes going to war and killing millions of people.
Yeah, I can't wrap my head around that either.
I think that the thing for me, like where I am with my work and the message that I'm trying to broadcast as much as possible now is, as we move into a time of increasing war, do not let people tell you that it is ideological. Do not let people use religion or relationship or history or any of these things. Like, what we know is that economies that are committed to growth need more and more and more resources. That is it. To me, everything is a resource war, essentially. If it's on a large scale, if it involves countries, it's a resource war. The only things that aren't resource war are like small scale tribal wars, essentially. They can be ideological. But this, what we're seeing around the world, it is all about resource grabs. And I think we really, really, really need to maintain that lens through the next few years in order to understand the correlations between all of these wars that are going on and more that will start. Because it's only once we start to understand them as results of the same driver that I think we're going to be able to like organize and mobilize globally around the world around this, you know? Yeah, I think that's probably the main, as listeners can hear, I'm like extremely passionate about this. I find it very distressing.
It's incredibly distressing, and I totally share your feelings on that. Yeah, I'm not sure what else to say about it. It is a super grim topic, and there's really not much more for me to comment about it. I think you both dissected this pretty well, and I think I'd just like to leave it at that.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for all the additional context that you provided in in this, it's really, really important that people know how far back this all goes.
Yeah. Well, I will see you on the next one, Rachel.
See you there.
If you'd like to read more from Dahr Jamail, you can find a link to his website here in the show notes. If you're interested to learn more about the loss of life figures cited by the Cost of War Project, you can also find those in the show notes here as well. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay Newscast or any of our podcast content like our sister series Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work that we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is definitely the best way to help expand our reach. But you can also support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news outlet. Even just $1 per month does make a difference and helps us offset production costs. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay Newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay Newscast over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. But you can also read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or you can follow us on social media. Find Mongabay via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News, or on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. Thank you, as always, for listening.